and good afternoon if you are here on the East Coast, as I am out in Boston. And as it turns out today, we are covering a topic of data privacy in an era of artificial intelligence, all while I'm sitting here at an AI governance summit. So I'm actually in two places at once, but really grateful for you all joining us here today. I'm Leila Golchehreh, the co-founder and co-CEO of Reliance AI. I'm an entrepreneur, lawyer, and data protection professional, very passionate about building new products in the data protection and data governance space, especially leveraging AI for good. As the co-founder and co-CEO of Reliance AI, I use some of my firsthand experience just with the pain of trying to build programs without the right technology and tooling. And it is just a pleasure to be here with you today to talk about two of my favorite subjects, which are AI technology and data privacy. There are ways to harness the power of AI for good. And prior to Reliance, just some background, I worked in Europe and across the Americas for international law firms and organizations, including Allen and Overy, the US mission to the EU, the International Court of Arbitration, and the OECD, which is a very important organization because they publish some of the very first privacy principles that serve as the baseline for many new laws and regulations that we're seeing today. I'm very proud to support women in technology however I can, and especially those that are working in data protection. So let's go ahead and dive in. We are here today to talk about AI and generative AI in particular, and the various privacy challenges, opportunities, and considerations as we collectively experience this AI renaissance. I have a brief agenda here. So we'll first talk about what generative AI is, then we'll go over an overview of the tech, the fear that we're kind of seeing around AI, but how AI can actually be used for good. And I'd like to talk a little bit, because as it turns out, this week in particular was very active in the way of AI new regulations, but also some of the top 5 most important privacy considerations that we need to really be thinking about as we're building privacy and security programs at our organizations as we go through this AI renaissance. So let's talk about what generative AI actually is and some of the use cases, because there's really been a flurry of discussions about generative AI and large language models and things that are really coming up in the space, whether that's about risks or new products or just generally the output of generative AI. So both the image and the text that you're looking at on this slide were used by AI tools that I had put into place. And I said, listen, generate an image of an AI that cares about privacy. This is what it rendered. And I asked the AI to actually tell me through ChatGPT to describe itself. And it said that imagine a world where machines can become your creative collaborators, harnessing the power of data and algorithms to produce art, music, and stories that rival the works of our greatest human creators. So that is the AI version. I will give you my probably more boring version now. Generative AI is really a field within artificial intelligence that involves deep learning models like neural networks, which are used in order to both analyze outputs and generate new content. So this content can really range from anything from text to PowerPoint presentations, as you can see, video, images, and otherwise. And this is the first time in history where we used to need to understand the user interface. Now the user interface understands us as humans. This presents both great opportunities and a lot of challenges, obviously in the way of data privacy. We're going to cover that today, but also across many different dimensions. And because of the power of generative AI, it's very important that as data protection professionals, we consider those important ethical, social, economic, legal, and privacy considerations. So today that we'll go ahead and focus on data privacy specifically. I'd like to just spend one moment talking a little bit about my company, Reliance AI, because we have really leveraged the opportunity to build in using large language models and generative AI to analyze how data is being processed, who is accessing that data, and what is done to it. A lot of the things that we have to do manually today, whether it's data mapping and inventory, building those Article 30 records of processing activity, understanding where we might be under processing data with a third-party vendor and there might be too much risk. We are now using AI in order to automate many, many aspects of that. Other things we do are in the assessment area. We can automate as much as 80% of your security and privacy assessments using the power of generative AI and large language models and a real understanding of what's going on in your particular environment. So, I'd like to go ahead and talk just broadly around some of the regulatory and legal updates in AI and generally talk through what we have been seeing in the United States just over the last couple of weeks, as well as what we are seeing globally, because these are some of the things that we want to think about kind of more broadly as we are building new programs for privacy and security within our organizations. So, specifically, this is a very interesting week for AI because a lot has been happening just here in the US alone. Kamala Harris had announced a new AI Safety Institute just a few days ago to protect American consumers by building a new standards body within the NIST framework to help guide safe AI development. This is a really major development in that they are using some of the existing first principles that we are seeing across various NIST frameworks in order to really build effectively in the area of AI. Now, this means that what we can do is look to some of the existing principles that we have applied in practice from a privacy and from a security perspective and employ that as we think about data governance and data protection broadly in the way of AI. So, Vice President Harris had announced the AI Safety Institute that will be responsible for actually creating and publishing guidelines. We'll have benchmark tests and best practices for testing and potentially evaluating potentially dangerous AI systems. Very important consideration as well as you're thinking about these AI frameworks and things that you should be considering. We also had just recently the first release of a draft policy guidance on the federal government's use of AI. Now, I'll tell you, on my flight over here to Boston for the very first time, we used an eye scan in order to get through my TSA pre-check. I had never seen that before, but we can clearly see that the use of recognition technology and AI is being more and more heavily adopted by the federal government. So it's going to be very important that not only are we regulating industry and getting a clear picture of the use of AI and taking into account these privacy considerations from a consumer and industry perspective, but also from a federal government perspective as well. And finally, this week, we just saw the declaration on responsible military applications for the emerging technology market. I think this is also a very important topic. Obviously, there will be privacy implications as it relates to navigating personal data, but also we will certainly see more security implications here as well. So now that we've talked a little bit about some of the developments this week alone, just here in the United States, there's also a lot going down in the EU in the way of AI. And what's very interesting is that some of the regulatory bodies in Europe that are generally responsible for building out privacy principles are now looking to build out AI principles as well. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of these major developments because we have seen a lot of interest regarding regulating AI by European regulators, just as we've been seeing here in the US. The US was coming, this just happens to be the most recent, but the EU has been talking about AI for even longer. Some of the earliest rumblings have come from European data protection authorities. We actually saw the Italian data protection authority called the Garanci shut down ChatGPT in Italy due to data protection reasons because of data privacy. And why was that? They were missing out on information that was leading to transparency. There were issues with communication and getting the right consent. And as we get into the later parts of the presentation, I'll talk through 5 of the most key things that you should be thinking about with respect to privacy and AI. And I think, in building these principles, what I wanted to do was really take a look at what this regulatory landscape looked like, because the EU, because they've had more time to regulate in this space, has allowed us the opportunity to really look at what are some of those key principles that may take effect not only in Europe, but also across the rest of the world. Just as the GDPR started in the EU, there has been a domino effect across the rest of the world. California being one state adopting a new privacy law, but now we've seen it across really the entirety of the US. So let's talk a little bit about the French regulator. I wanted to talk through some of those recent principles they've published. And again, this is the same regulatory body that regulates for data privacy, is now also thinking about it in the AI perspective. So it's interesting in that because this is really an emerging field, you're seeing a convergence of privacy and AI across the board. But France published a report recently around some of the principles that are very important in considering how to govern AI. Now, a lot of these principles actually relate directly to data privacy challenges. So I want to just provide that framework, and then we'll get into some of the things that we really should be thinking about from a privacy perspective. So, first and foremost, fairness and transparency. The processing, the data processing underlying the application of AI tools must be fair, and we must be very transparent. This is also a privacy consideration. So, one of the other parallels between everything going on in the world of AI governance, as well as everything going on in the way of privacy as well. Then the protection of publicly available data on the web, really against the use of scraping or scraping technology, or data for design tools, also very important. And one of the reasons for this, which also very much is in parallel with some of the privacy decisions that have come out of some of the European regulatory bodies, is that just because information is available on the internet and it's publicly available, especially if it includes personal information, does not mean we can just go and scrape off that data and use it in the models that we train. This is very important because often large language models require tremendous amounts of data. Where does that data come from? Often engineers will say, well, it's on the internet, so why can't we go and just access it? Well, there are going to be rules around that. And it's very important to know that even in the EU, if you are trying to use this, and if you're not in the EU but subject to European data protection laws, and across some states here in the US, you may not be able to just use publicly available data if it is personal data. So, as you are starting to think about what types of frameworks you're going to put in place, make sure that you have scraping in mind, and that you evaluate whether there are personal data elements that might be included, or there might be any kind of privacy implications in the use of that data. One of the next key points that the French regulator had put out is really the protection of data that is transmitted by users. That needs to have all the same privacy and security controls and principles intact, so that when they use tools, AI tools, ranging from their collection, whether that's through an interface or otherwise, to their possible reuse and processing through machine learning algorithms, we must keep in place some of those data protection controls on the security and privacy side. And we'll get into some of the things to consider on that dimension in just a moment here. We also need to be considering the consequences for the rights and individuals to their datas, both in relation to those collected for the learning of models and those which may be provided by those systems, such as content created, as is the case in the use of generative AI. Next, we really need to be thinking about bias and discrimination. And again, these are both very much aligned to the data protection and privacy principles. So we're talking broadly now about AI governance, but everything we talk about in the way of AI governance relates directly to a lot of those privacy first principles. We cannot have bias, we cannot have discrimination in our algorithms, and we're going to need to carry out similar AI governance assessments in order to really understand whether there may be any bias or discrimination. And then finally, and we would not be at the security conference if we did not talk about security, the unprecedented security challenges that we're seeing of these different tools. there are going to be tremendous amounts of data. And so as you are thinking about building these tools, not only do you have to ensure if you've gotten the right consent, and we'll talk about more of some of these privacy principles in just a moment, but that the security controls are in place that are really going to protect against outside threats and other privacy challenges, especially if those large language models include the personal data of any individuals. So something else really to keep in mind. Something else I wanted to mention is that in June of this year, the European members of parliament adopted the parliament's negotiating position on what's called the AI Act. So there is some overlap with things like the GDPR, some of those laws and regulations that were in place. But what we're seeing now is that this is really the next step in a process, and talks are going on now with EU countries and the European Council on the final form of the law. So we'll be able to really get an understanding of what's going on with respect to that, and hopefully before the end of this year, which is really the aim, that will help to give us more clarity in a pretty new and emerging field. But in general, some top level points to know about this AI Act is that this would really give the European government the authority to fine AI companies that do not abide by its rules. Just like the GDPR had teeth, and that if there were privacy or there were any kind of security violations, the European regulators could fine a company either 2% or 4% of their annual global revenue. That's really significant. And the EU regulators know that in order to get companies across Silicon Valley to really pay attention to some of the European regulations, if they are subject to any of these European regulations, that these regulations need to have teeth. There has to be an enforcement mechanism. We have to have that ability to enforce various data protection laws and have something behind it so that we're really clear on that ability of the European regulators to enforce. And we let folks know that they are very much taking this seriously. Also, really important to keep in mind that as we are thinking about not only privacy, but AI broadly, that certainly the European regulators are going to begin enforcement actions as soon as this AI Act is actually adopted. So it's really important that you start to put into place not only some of the privacy controls that we're going to talk about here in just a minute, but also that you're considering some of these new requirements around AI. So as far as the AI Act is concerned, the Act would actually give the European government the authority to fine AI companies that do not abide by the Act. Financial penalties might be even higher than GDPR in this case. So really taking that very seriously as far as making sure that companies are doing the right ethical things with the use of AI. But it might amount to 40 million euro, or an amount equal to up to 7% of a company's worldwide annual turnover, whichever is higher. So that's very important to consider as you are building out your frameworks. And it's important to talk with your organization both about the opportunities to offer more ethical AI practices, but also the risks in not doing so, especially if you are subject to some of these European data protection laws. And what frequently happens, and I've seen across my 15-year career in data privacy and technology, when Europe goes and adopts a law like this, California does so next, and then you see a domino effect across the rest of the world. This is certainly what we are starting to see in the privacy landscape. Across the rest of the United States, we have new privacy and data protection laws excuse me, which are coming up across different states across the country. And it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole at the moment because the laws and regulations and requirements are just changing so incredibly quickly. One other thing I want to point out before moving off of some of the global regulatory landscape around AI and how privacy principles often relate. EU lawmakers are really seeking to limit or prohibit AI technology that they classify as having an unacceptable or high risk. So, for example, predictive policing systems and real-time or remote biometric identification systems, as I was just referring to at the airport here, would be banned, and strong restrictions would be placed on AI tools that influence voters on social media. These are some of the fundamental issues that we are facing as a society today, and the European regulators are really trying to get on top of this and get ahead of it. The act would also require that generative AI systems like ChatGPT disclose what copyrighted material is used to train its models. And ChatGPT must identify AI generated content to just mitigate that risk of spreading misinformation because it's also traveling so fast. So these are some of the other considerations in addition to privacy that you should be thinking about as you are building out your programs. Okay, so now that we've gone there, I will get into really those top 5 most important privacy considerations that you should be thinking about in this era of AI, what you came to this presentation to learn. So let's talk about data consent, and really this should read data consent and transparency. Are you, as an organization, doing what you say and saying what you do? Individuals absolutely must be informed about what data you intend to process, how that data might be collected, who is going to access that data, and what is going to be done with that data. 4 of the things that my company, Reliance AI, helps with. Now, it's very important that, especially if you are acting in Europe, that you're providing explicit and informed consent before processing individual information. Do you have the rights to do what you're doing with that data? We talked about web scraping just a moment ago. It's very important that you have those rights. Just because something's available on the internet does not give you the right to go and use it because it's publicly available. And at the same time, as we think about this, and I know that this sometimes can feel like a challenge, which I'd like to talk about, but as we think about data consent and transparency, we should also be thinking about data minimization. We should be practicing data minimization, collecting and retaining only the data that's necessary for the purpose. That is a very core tenet of privacy and security principles. And security speak, it's the principle of least privilege. The same is very much true in the way of privacy. And now you may have conversations with engineers inside your organization where they might say, well, we need all the data. Well, how much data do you need? And as a former privacy counsel to an autonomous vehicle company, the answer was always all the data. We need all of it. Well, guess what? Actually, if you get less but more precise data that is more relevant to what you're doing, you might not need all of it. And when it's more precise, even when it's less, and this is a conversation where you can really get the AI and ML teams on your side, your models, your algorithms are going to make more accurate predictions. You're going to get better and better with the right data inputs. So something very important to keep in mind as we think about data consent, transparency, and data minimization as one of the first key privacy principles. Second, and it would obviously, I wouldn't be attending this conference if it wasn't on security and privacy, but data security. We must implement strong encryption at rest and in transit controls, along with many other types of security controls. You can look to different frameworks, whether that's the SOC 2 Type 2, or of course, we have the NIST framework that we've already referenced, and that dovetails very nicely into some of the developments that our Vice President mentioned over the past week. But really in embedding those security tactics across the organization to protect data during storage and transmission is just so critical. In addition, we really need to address sensitive data and make sure that we have the right controls in place to limit that access to those authorized personnel and systems as we're thinking about how to really build the program, with those access to permissions that are regularly reviewed and updated. Now, naturally, this is a security concept, but I think this becomes even more and more important when you are dealing with personal data. You really need to look at tightening up those controls, ensuring that, especially when you're dealing in areas that might have sensitive content, that you have kind of developed that and that it's very clear for you who is accessing that data, and you're limiting that to those who really need access to the data. Next, we have data transparency. So AI algorithms and decision-making processes really need to be as transparent as possible, allowing individuals to understand how and why decisions are made. AI systems should be developed to provide clear and comprehensive explanations for their actions, especially when you are working in AI in critical domains subject to other privacy laws like healthcare, which is subject to HIPAA, or financial services or finance generally, which might be subject to the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. So make sure that that is embedded into the way that the models are being built. Next, we have anonymization and de-identification, principles that you should generally be thinking about from a security perspective, but certainly as it relates to where personal data may live. We really need to build de-identification and anonymization into our practices as we are building new models or removing or obscuring personal information from data sets to really prevent the re-identification of individuals. It is incredible how little information we need in order to personally identify a person. There are, I know we just have 5 minutes left here, but a lot of studies around how easy it is to identify a person, even with very, very limited access to information. With just something like 90 seconds of tracking an AI headset movements, excuse me, a VR AR headset, and with just your movements and tracking in 90 seconds, we can identify with over 92% accuracy who that individual is. That is pretty incredible. And it just means that there may be ways of identifying an individual that you had not considered, but by connecting various data types, and especially as we go through this AI renaissance, it'll be incredibly important to keep evaluating and to keep reassessing when, in combination with one or more data types, we can begin identifying who a person is. And then finally, we really need to ensure that we have ethical AI and bias mitigation. If we're looking at some of the French guidance, and then certainly some of the discussions that are happening here in the US, we really need to continuously audit those AI systems for bias and discrimination, and make sure that we're taking steps to reduce and rectify those biases. Now, this is not only a privacy concept, but it's really a concept around ethics and generally data processing across the board. Fairness and equity should really be core as you are developing your AI algorithms. So it is very important that even as data protection professionals, we're also representing what is important from an ethical perspective in building AI models. I'd like to ask the question, just because we can, does it mean we should? And really consider that as you are building models and working with your engineering team. We want to make sure that we don't perpetrate or contribute to any existing social inequities. So that is an overview. Thank you all so much for joining. It's been a pleasure. I'm so grateful to be here and to participate in the security event. I'm going to take a quick pause here to see the chat, if there are any particular questions I might answer quickly, and we can go ahead. See, I think this was mostly commentary, but some wonderful comments here. And I don't believe there are actually any questions here. But I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you all for spending the time with me here today. And best of luck. We are entering into a very interesting period around data privacy. And as we go through these changes with rapid developments in AI, with some of the most important challenges facing our society today. If you'd like to reach out, I can be reached on LinkedIn. I'm just Leila Golchehreh on LinkedIn, or you can visit our site at Reliance, that's RELYANCE.ai. Thank you all very much.